Yeah.
Right. Going to transition the face. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
Today, we're going to talk a little bit about uh, video game reviews from the product, basically differentiating or comparing video games as product versus video games as art. But before we do that, buddy, why don't you show the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we like to talk about games, and this is a follow-up to. Okay, so 3.
It was two shows ago.
What is time?
Well, it's two, maybe three shows ago if we break character, and then like a couple weeks past that, because we had the other that weird episode on that Friday.
True, right. Okay, yes. So, whatever the case may be, in our Elden Ring episode, we brought up this idea of like the complicated nature of reviews for games and Elden Ring, right? Because obviously Elden Ring is insanely well received. People are having a very good time with the game. And they think that the game is quite good, right? It is popular. People on Twitter are going nuts about it, right? Like Elden Ring is functionally a good game, right? But it is also getting reviews that reflect that. And the question becomes, in a world where the PC build of the game has stutter issues that are pretty common and widely known, everybody I have talked to has mentioned some issues along these sorts of lines with the game, right? Does that detract from its ability to be a 10 out of a 10, amazing, extraordinary stand-up game, that kind of a thing?
Yep, and there's there are kind of equivalent things for many other games as well, right? Like one that I usually harp on about is the ability to remap keybinds, which Elden Ring is also terrible at, but I'm using a gamepad, so I just kind of don't notice that. Like how much do we think that a reviewer is obligated to take these factors into consideration when providing a review? I do think that there's like this is kind of started out. I think that like there's space for each outlet to kind of like kind of view how much they're going to take those factors into consideration. But I think your standard kind of like I almost hate to say this, but like IGN is kind of like the equivalent of what I guess like the New York Times for gaming journalism, right? Like
Yeah, I guess so.
yeah, like what comparison are you gonna make here, right? Like
Maybe the CNN, maybe I guess.
yeah, maybe I don't know.
Did it get a 10 out of 10 on IGN?
I actually don't know. That's a good point. Do you like? I think some outlets will like make notes for them. Some outlets will specifically review specific versions of the game. Like this is a thing that can be important if there's differentiated content. But yeah, I got a 10 out of 10 on IGN.
Wow, yeah, look at that.
But yeah, so do you have any thoughts coming out of this?
Yeah, so I mean, so the initial framework, let's just to set a baseline, right? There's this idea, there's kind of two ideas. One is there's this idea of the review as consumer report, right? Where, you are in the way that you would check the what is a good and a bad car, right? Like you would check what is a good and a bad video game on a very practical kind of like functional level. There's that. This is one philosophy of the video game review. Another philosophy of video game review is more like a movie review, right? Where it is almost a version of art in and of itself, right? A YouTube video essay or a written review or even just, like a podcast episode, right? Like some amount of that is reflecting whether or not, the thing is a good or bad, entertaining product, whatever. But some amount of it is also just talking about it on an artistic level, right? And I think that's the real tension. If I'm coming at this from an art perspective, I'm probably going to ignore a lot of these low-level functionality things because they just kind of don't matter, you know? Nobody would think that it would be fair to give a bad movie review because you watched a movie in a theater with a crying baby next to you, right? Which is kind of similar to the, you know, like what happens when you're playing a game but on your specific machine it doesn't play that well, right? But it's also more complicated than that because part of it is like, well, I want a thing to work on my machine, right?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that's where this whole thing gets really thorny, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and on top of that too, like you would also criticize a movie if like you had like a gratuitous boom mic like clips into shots, right? And like, you know, there are mechanical elements of films that get criticized, like, you know, like some things like say cinematography and like lighting and whatnot, like, and like things that are like some level creative choice, but are also some level like technical skill, right? Like kind of blur these lines, and they're not exactly one-to-one parallel, but I think there are parallels there. And your point as well, right? Like there's a kind of difference between it not performing well on my PC, which is the one of like, you know, near infinite combination of configurations, but there's also like performance on like a console, right? Which is supposed to provide this uniform experience, right? Like if it works well on, you know, the Xbox Series X, but not the S, like how much do you dock, like, you know, like how much do you dock a point for that, right? Like,
Mhm.
um, I mean, this is also like kind of like a, you know, an endless conversation. Like, how much do we care about how good the graphics look in the first place, right? Like, how much does the visual spectacle matter? And that's something that is
Yeah,
also
because it
transcends across
does.
movies.
That is the kind of thing that people will get really angry about, right? You know, like clipping issues on a model. People will like go really hard about that, which I've always found to be kind of strange. But it's just sort of like I don't know. It doesn't have an easy sort of like one-to-one thing to kind of compare it to, because at the end of the day, clipping is kind of a it's just sort of like the nature of creating these like character models and like animation and everything like that. And we have in the past kind of made you know, like we have personally said I'm fine with a low polygon model of Lara Croft or whatever. I'm willing to sort of like fill in these blanks, but at a certain point people are kind of like unwilling to give it the benefit of that doubt, which I think is a I don't know. It's just like there's so many like complicated layers on top of this issue.
Yeah, I mean, especially because like some, it's like I don't know, like with the graphics thing in particular, right? You can see differences between where particular graphical styles and like are made as a choice, right? Like you can make pixel art, like, you know, pixel art indie game is like a meme at this point, right? And you know, you could be making a specific artistic choice to do that level, and sometimes, and like, you know, sometimes that's also like you're making that artistic choice because it is you're constrained by like your ability to do 3D art essentially, right? Like
Hmm.
it's a tough thing to consider, and I don't know. We haven't really placed down any kind of like real thoughts, but we just like kind of outlined how it's
Yeah, that's
difficult.
true. We've just kind of been drawing outline around thoughts. Okay, I guess here's my thing is always going to be that I want criticism to like I want like game reviews and game criticism to be more on that art form level because I think that it represents a just sort of I don't know. It just feels like that to me feels like the underdog that I'm rooting for in a way. Do you know what I mean? Where it's like a more technical review of the game as product boils down a lot of what that game does in a way that I don't think is complex or interesting. And I want to preserve the kind of complex interesting discussion of how mechanics, aesthetics, all of these things kind of marry together to create a whole product, right? Um is
Yeah,
that does that parse on any level?
it does. I feel like it's one of those things where like it has to be taken into account, but like it has to be, but like you know, if a game won't boot, right? Like that's like a failure, right? Like if you know a movie were to come out and every copy of the movie, like I don't know, let's make up some like weird hypothetical where like, you know, the digital encoding of a particular movie caused every projector it was ever put on to fucking fall over and fail, right? Then like I think that could be a valid criticism of the movie, maybe. But like, so I think there's kind of like a threshold. It's got to be like a threshold problem, right? Like you know, once you're past this threshold, it's fine. That or like you know, have a space for dedicated PC reviews of this kind of thing, right? Like I don't know. I feel like a lot of
Yeah,
this stuff,
Total
like
Biscuit used to do that, the
yeah,
port report, right?
yeah,
Which was a very useful piece of, you know, like his kind of brand and his series. Because well, you know, the thing that makes, you know, just like talking on a game development level, the thing that makes developing for consoles nice is they're standardized, right? You have targets to hit. Now, the targets to hit are harder to hit, right? It is I can like from experience I can tell you, it is harder to ship a game onto Nintendo than it is to ship a game onto Steam, right? Or just PC in general, DRM free, just like the PC game, right? Uh, but the reason that that is but the reason that that is harder is because Nintendo is more stringent about what goes up than Steam is, right? When something goes up on Nintendo, it is going to be, generally speaking, put through a more rigorous ringer than when something goes up on Steam, where basically the only check is the thing malware? No, okay, that's fine, right? Um, and I guess I feel like that makes me want to give a bit you know, give a little slack, give a little leeway to these kinds of things. Every PC configuration is different, and having to run a thing on all of those PC configurations is very complicated and hard.
yeah. I agree with that, but that's also kind of like the name of the game, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, I feel like so part of this too is that like you know, like I said, a lot of it seems to like work itself out in the wash, right? Like if it
Are you reading the chat?
yeah.
Ryan in chat says about the video that Mango is pitching. Honestly, that sounds like a weird art piece that would be highly reviewed in LA. Ah, yes. Famous indie director Hans Gludenberry has made a film that will blow up every projector it is put on.
Yeah, it's like a
It's an
piece of
art. It's an art piece. It's like
it's-
when that guy signed the urinal. I can't remember what that thing is
yeah.
called, but
Or like there was like a guy who like stapled or not stapled, taped a banana to a wall, and then some other artist ate it and was like, "This is also art," which is like,
yeah, or it's like or it's like 333, which is the musical piece that is 3 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. There's
yeah.
no there's
I think
it's
there's
all there's no music.
I think there's multiple songs of different lengths that are
Oh yeah.
that.
Well, it's because that guy, everyone interpreted 333 in such a way, and anytime a popular interpretation like took the foreground, he released a new version of it with new rules to disprove whatever the prevailing theory is. So I think that there are 4 or 5 versions of them now, and they all have weird addendums to like not only is it silent, but you have to do this, you have to do that, etc.
No, I would say I'm pretty sure that there's like I think there are like other tracks by different artists that are also like I think there might be one that was just like you know also pretentious but like totally devoid from it or divorced from it rather. Um, my favorite.
My favorite is the one where the cleaning lady threw out a like several $1 million art piece because it was a pile of garbage. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we could get into the absurdities of modern art forever, but kind of like winding back
Mhm.
to the topic at hand. I think for the most part, most of this works itself out in the wash, right? If there's a very egregious technical error, those tend to show up in reviews, right? And I think that that's warranted, right? Like I think one of the more famous ones is like the re-release of Steel Battalion, which is supposed to like replace like that giant $100+ controller with motion controls, just like didn't work. Um,
Mhm.
and that surfaced in all of the reviews. And targeted console games tend to do this as well. Whereas like you know New World, which we played, had a habit of killing specific video cards. And that didn't really show up in the reviews, but it did show up in kind of like discussion around the game. And so it didn't particularly affect review scores as far as I could tell. Um, But
Yeah, and there's also bigger problems that kind of echo out from this as well. So for instance, okay, how do you parse a problem like that with the fact that a patch can be released a couple, however long, right? Like, so, just to put this in my terms, Cardboard Kings released earlier this year, came out in January of this year. Day one, there is an issue with players where they can hit a certain edge case scenario and bork their save file, right? Within the day, before 24 hours have elapsed since the release of Cardboard Kings, we put out a patch that fixes that issue and unborks their saves, right? To what extent do I get do we get credit for fixing the problem swiftly, and to what extent is it fair for, there are probably Steam reviews, not even probably, I know there are Steam reviews, there are Steam reviews for people who bought the game on launch, ran into this problem, said this game is fucked, don't buy it, right? And even though it has been fixed, and it was fixed less than a day after release, right, those reviews are still up. Is that fair? Yes, no. And that's a really complicated, how do you answer that question, right? Like, yeah, it's just really tough to parse.
yeah, I think for like group reviews, you can like introduce tools that like help that, right? Like mark like this is a negative review because of a technical issue, and then you like nail that to the version that it's on, right?
Yeah.
But from like a review a review outlet perspective, that's hard to deal with, right? Like especially because like they might not like those things like you might not run into by chance, right? Like,
Yep.
I think particularly like this isn't about like specific technical issues, but like very egregious thing that happened. It was one of the racing games. I think it was like Forza. Don't quote me on this. I will feel bad if I slander their Forza's name with this. But essentially, the review copy had much less like microtransactions in it, and much less of kind of like the grindy aspects in it. For the review codes, and then when launch day came, like all those systems turned on, and so like those kind of particular aspects, like the monetization aspect, is something else we've talked about. We're not part of the review corpus because effectively the reviewers were playing a different version of the game. At what level should a reviewer review a kind of like game in that kind of free to play model or the DLC model where lots of content is locked behind either a grind or lots of microtransactions? Should they like in some like League of Legends, like reviewing League of Legends would be like a weird thing to do, but like I like there's like
Okay. Actually, I have a weird case study for this, which is Total War Warhammer 3, right?
Right.
I've referenced on the podcast that there was controversy about the release of Total War Warhammer 3, but I don't think I've actually ever explained it. So here we go, right? Total War Warhammer 3 is obviously an insanely hyped, huge release for the Creative Assembly and the burgeoning community that kind of came up around it, right? Total War Warhammer 2 was so popular that it actually hit its Steam concurrent player like 3 years after launch. On the release of a specific DLC, there were more players playing Total War Warhammer 2 than there were players at launch playing Total War Warhammer 2, right? Which is a very unheard of thing, especially for a game like that, right? You would expect a game like Total War Warhammer 2 to have a big burst in the beginning, people fall off, right? A long tail with little blips as people hit up all the DLCs kind of like later down the line. Here's the crazy thing that happened with the launch of Warhammer 3. People are coming into Warhammer 3 hot off the heels of that hot on the heels of that long tail, right? I have been playing Total War Warhammer 2 for the intervening 4 years, right, since the release of Total War Warhammer 2. And it is functioning as a games as service model for me. Every couple of months, there's a new content patch. That new content patch has a new legendary lord, a bunch of new units, a bunch of whatever, right? Maybe it has a faction or something like that, right? That's kind of the world that they're living in, right? But when Total War Warhammer 3 releases, it is reviewed in the way the Total War Warhammer 1 and 2 were released, right? Which is just, this is a game, it's going to fill maybe 50 or 100 hours of your time, and is it a good or bad version of that, right? Total War Warhammer 3 gets very, very good reviews, right? People are enjoying it out of the box. This is the first like week or two. Then underneath the surface, this kind of I don't want to call it like outrage. Like I do think outrage is a piece of it, but it's not really defined by outrage. This sort of undercurrent of the games as service players are now saying, well, Total War Warhammer 3 is really frustrating and I don't like it, and here's the reason why, right? And they essentially outline how a bunch of new features that are in Total War Warhammer 3 don't are kind of preventing them from playing the game in the way that they want to, right? They want to paint the map red, and Warhammer 3 has a bunch of kind of friction points preventing that from happening. The one of the biggest Total War Warhammer YouTubers who plays the game as it is a service, he has put 13,000 hours into Total War Warhammer 2, right? He is the kind of person who is releasing all of these, releasing Warhammer 2 videos constantly over the course of these years. He's releasing speculation videos about what the next DLC, right? He goes on his stream and he says that he regrets a bunch of stuff he said in his initial review because he was bothered by all of these mechanics that were underlying whatever, but at the time he just sort of felt like it was unfair to criticize the long-term fun of those mechanics, right? So the question in this situation is, was the guy's name is Legend of Total War? Was Legend of Total War correct to review the game as a 100-hour experience, right? That somebody would play at the end of, February, they would get a certain amount of enjoyment from and move on from, right? Or should he review the game looking forward to it as a 15,000-hour experience supported by all this DLC and expansion packs and stuff like later down the line, that there is a real community that is asking for that kind of review. And once again, I don't think that there's a clear answer, right? Like basically Total War is simultaneously those two products because depending on what kind of a player you are, you're going to get hit by it in a different way, right? And it's impossible to sort of answer that. Though at the time, I also just want to say, for the record, I'm using this as a case study, but I also sort of think Legend of Total War is wrong because part of Legends of Total War's thing is just like weird, I don't know, like gamer outrage stuff that I don't really agree with, right? So this is an interesting case study, but I'm not trying to pick a side, and I kind of disagree with some of the ways that he's talked about the title and about the way that he revisited that review.
Yeah, no, so that's interesting because like you said, it's kind of hard to say what the correct way to approach that is, and like what like even the right frame there is, like, is the right, like, I think it's kind of unfair at some level to say like we have to evaluate Total Warhammer 3 and Total Warhammer 2's terms, right?
Yeah.
Or like this also happens in fighting games, right? Street Fighter 6 got announced recently, but when Street Fighter 5 came out, it obviously had a much smaller roster than Street Fighter 4 at the end of its life cycle. It's because it was a new game and they were resetting everything. In addition to kind of like, I think the systems kind of changed a little bit more between like fighting games than fighting games entries than I think between Total War and Total Warhammer 3, just because like it's not trying to, it's like the fighting games kind of reinvent themselves a little bit with each iteration. But there are people who still go back and play like Street Fighter 2, right? Like, are we supposed to evaluate Street Fighter 6 on Street Fighter 2's metrics? But and, I don't know. I think this maybe speaks to kind of the benefit of living in kind of this information age, right? We're we're all kind of fractured, but like you can go find your whole, like you can find a reviewer that matches your taste. If you want someone who just talks about theming, you can find somebody who does that, right? If you want to find somebody who talks primarily about mechanics, then like there's like Boomstick Gaming, right? He's the guy who came to some prominence. Somebody at like, I think it was Polygon, basically copied one of his reviews kind of word for word.
Wow.
Really, he was like, this was a big story when it happened, right? And
Okay.
And he got caught. And so like I got pushed to Boomstick at that point, and it was I think it was a review of Dead Cells.
Okay.
But like Boomstick's the whole thing is like he focuses primarily on mechanics, and he is very upfront about that. Like this is the style of review I provide. If you'd like to see that, come here for that. And I think similarly, right? Like Total Biscuit with the port report. I love those port reports because I primarily play on PC.
Yep, me too.
God rest his soul. And I think there are people who are probably filling that role at various points in time. Um, but having that diversity of kind of expression, because the major gaming publications, right, like, are putting out a lot more opinion pieces that don't have a score attached to them, right? Like, I think Polygon doesn't do scores anymore, if I'm correct, or one of the major outlets doesn't do scores anymore.
Polygon or Kotaku.
And like, so, and then, like, Kotaku will have opinion pieces alongside that are not that are not reviews per se, but, like, have something to say about the game, right? Like,
Yeah, and I like those opinion pieces. And I think if someone is going to convince me that product reviews are the right way to approach video game reviews, right? I think the Steelman version of that case might be pointing to those opinion pieces, and to things like the Tokimeki Memorial review that
Tim, what is his name?
God, what is his name? This is killing me. Action Button. It's Action Button. I'm trying to think of his name, but Action Button Reviews is the thing, right? The stuff that Aaron Signo does, I've plugged him on the podcast before. Noah Caldwell Gervais does reviews like these.
Tim Rogers.
Tim Rod, yeah. H Bomber guy put out, he just put out a 3.5 hour video about Deus Ex, Human Revolution. And almost all of those are very long in the rear view mirror retrospectives, right? No one is really putting out these sorts of high-end reviews of games right on top of their release, right? It comes out a couple months after. And the same thing is true kind of for other stuff too, right? Like the best video essays that are about like recent that are about like recent movies tend to come a couple of weeks after those movies have come out. Have come out on Blu-ray, actually, right? So a couple of months after they have come out in theaters. It's kind of rare and not all that common for something to be out in theaters and you to have hour-long video essays discussing that, discussing that thing as kind of a piece of criticism, right? And so, if we posit that the best place to perform review as criticism as art, right, is a couple of months after release where you can really digest the thing, you can see the full experience, right? You can examine the context in which it came out kind of with the benefit of some hindsight and some perspective, right? It makes sense to say those don't have to happen at launch, and therefore the reviews that do come out at launch should be product reviews, like in IGN or whatever else, right? Is this game worth it to buy right now? Yes, no. A lot of function or a lot of attention is paid to technical issues and problems that may or may not exist.
Yep. Yeah, and on top of that, like, you can. So I think that's, like, I'm thinking about this in kind of like in the movie sense as well, right? As you highlighted,
Yeah.
right? Like, but, like, on the other hand, I am never, like, I don't care how many years down the line, I'm not gonna go back and say that Morbius is like a hidden gem, right? Like, it's
you got me. That's true.
Or, like, even if there is even if, like, maybe to give a stronger case, right? Like, in a couple of months after the Morbius Blu-ray comes out, somebody sits down and says, this is exactly the things that went wrong with Morbius and why it doesn't work in kind of excruciating detail. I think there's a place for that that's valuable. There's also a place for kind of like an off-the-cuff kind of like, Morbius does these basic things bad that I can tell at like a first pass without watching it 3 times, right?
Yeah.
Like, and the same thing, like, and weirdly, that's almost kind of like evaluating, like doing art criticism as a product review in like a way, right? Like, that kind of like high level kind of like, even if you don't care about, like, essentially like like technical. I want to almost call it like technical implementation of artistic stuff, right? This is kind of like, in some ways, my earlier thoughts about the cinematography and, like, very basic stuff like keeping boom mics out of shots, right? But also kind of like, I can talk about how well I thought certain themes were implemented and how smoothly they flowed without being jarring, without necessarily going into a deeper exploration of those themes, and kind of like, or like judgments on like what those themes are, right? Like, this is even like this is like kind of a hard thing to do, right? Like uh in the first place, is like, a theme that I think is well executed, but I don't agree with kind of like the conclusions of is kind of a thing that exists in as a piece of art criticism in general, right? Like, this is, I don't know. It's funny because
This is like Soul is a pro-life movie kind of thing, right? You're
yeah,
like, thematically speaking, Soul is about a person who has not yet been born, who is essentially on equal footing as another person who is in the middle of his life, right? And I'm not a pro-life person. I'm a pro-choice person, and I would disagree if, I mean, that's complicated. It's so
yeah,
complicated. I can't even really like form the thought, but like, yes, that is definitely a thing, right?
yeah, or like, I don't know, what's the other, like, BioShock, right? Like BioShock is like the one that famously has like, this is a criticism of Ayn Rand, right? Nailed into your fucking forehead, right? Like,
Yep.
um and it's, it's love for it, but like, it's I don't know. That's it's all, how much how much should a reviewer take any of, like, because there's also versions of that where, like, there are like play in the joint there, right? Like, your example, or the BioShock example, right? Like, these are things that, like, people will, like, can maybe separate themselves out from the message of, right? But like, that's also not going to apply in the same way to something like, was like Triumph of the Will, right? Like, like a
Yeah.
piece of like pure kind of like racist propaganda, right? Like, it's not going to, like, I suppose you could sit there and evaluate it on like that very, like, what was Birth of a Nation was like famously like what was important because of the
It was the first blockbuster, right?
There we go. Thank you.
It pioneered. I mean, I hate this. I hate Birth of a Nation. I watched it in college. It was fucking dumb. Colleges, by the way, are stopping this from happening, right? It was very common when I was in school and before, right, that you would watch Birth of a Nation and then your film professor would go, "Don't you see that it uses editing from the Kuleshov effect and this and that or whatever? It's really hateful and bad. It's really bad. It's really hateful. But wow, look at it do all of this, basic film technique stuff." Uh, that has sort of been dropped of late, mostly because it's just sort of bad history. Triumph of the Will wasn't the first, or I'm sorry, not Triumph of the Will. Birth of a Nation was not the first place that a lot of this stuff happened. It was just the first blockbuster, right? It was the first movie that was that popularized it, right? But there's actually a lot of stuff equally problematic and weird and bad or whatever that did it before Birth of a Nation did, right? But anyway, yeah, that movie is just on its face a racist, hateful movie that is, oh boy, real bad. Real bad. Arahi in the chat did not actually watch it in films for a good job. I'm proud
I
of you for
I have
for
also
skipping that bad boy.
I have also never watched Birth of a Nation, and I have never been to film school, so I think I'm winning on both fronts.
Yeah, I mean, Birth of a Nation also fucking sucks. It is like long, and it is not. I mean, this is true for a lot of those old movies. Some of them
Yeah.
are actually kind of bangers, especially especially the days of the Hays Code, because there's just like a lot of cool. I don't know. I've talked before about how there's this weird golden age of cinema that is happening under a very intense like censorship, and how that made films more clever and interesting because they're dodging, they're bobbing and weaving under the censors, right? But Birth of a Nation is not one of those movies. It is a slog. It is unfun, and it is like it might be 3.5 hours. It's really long.
Yeah, no, I mean, hey, so was Seven Samurai, right? Which is a movie we have
Yeah.
talked about at length.
Yeah, exactly. And Seven Samurai, right? It flows in just like a completely different way. Even Zack Snyder's Justice League. We talked about this, where the movie's twice as long as the theatrical version, but it's so much more watchable. And there's that kind of like magic to the whole thing. Anyway, I don't remember how we got onto this point, but yeah,
Yeah,
Birth of a Nation is a very hateful movie on its face.
yeah, and so kind of in that vein, right? Like, games are, like they are in many other ways, kind of an extension of cinema, in that like you're layering on these other layers of things that like theoretically We did a whole episode on Seven Samurai Arahe. True fans will know.
Yeah.
Um, we actually have done several episodes on Seven Samurai in spirit because we watched the
Yeah,
Magnificent
functionally
Seven,
speaking.
right? Because the Magnificent Seven episode was like a review of like the entire history of that like version of movie. But anyway, video games have added on this kind of like extra layer of like things that need to be contained within the review of the movie, right? That like or review of the piece of art that are not directly like the message of the art, right? Like you've got gameplay, right? You've got mechanics, you've got technical performance, you've got like you've got like kind of like graphics, right? Like which in some ways also applies to the movie, right? Like I was thinking, like I haven't watched UHF in a while. I was thinking about going back and watching it, the Weird Al movie.
Hell yeah, I have the Blu-ray of it just on the other side of the green screen.
But that movie has some like CG music videos, and they look terrible. It's kind of fine because like it's not supposed to be like it fits the style, but like there are like I don't know like going back and watching Toy Story, it doesn't look bad, but like it's noticeably dated, right? Like and
Yeah.
um
No,
yeah,
yeah, this is something that people talk about in like WoW all the time, right? Is you'll have super high res models from whatever the current expansion is, and super low res models from stuff that's in the classic vanilla era, right? Like if I'm leveling, and if I walk out of Stormwind, there's stuff in Stormwind that was put in Stormwind in BFA and Shadowlands that is like incredibly well textured, well done art, just because we have way more processing power and RAM to work with, right? And then you walk down to Goldshire and you have this like blocky tree, or this like little prairie dog that is like 4 polygons, right? Like right next to you, and it's like that's like that's something that can live side by side, and because it's all in the same sort of overarching aesthetic, it works to whatever extent.
yeah. A thought just popped into my mind, like, will we live to see like a remaster of Toy Story 1, right?
Oh
Like
my
these,
god, I didn't
like,
even think about that.
because this is the thing that games do all the time now, right? Like like update the game for current technology, because like that is obviously more a concern with games than it is with movies. But like I feel like there would be like a lot of pushback against that. In a way. Although I guess like the earliest version we got of that was the Star Wars special editions, right? Like a couple rounds of it.
Yeah, and I'm on record that I like a lot of the change. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, we talked about this in some of our Star Wars episodes, right? But like, to me, the Star Wars special editions are mostly good. It's just that they have a couple of very egregious problems that are, yes, laughably egregious and bad. But like, people hate the thing that people hate the Star Wars special editions for, are for those things that stick out like a sore thumb, right?
Right.
It is not for the things that like, oh, this shot is made better and more beautiful because they had a chance to change whatever the background was.
Arahe says, I'm sure after live action Toy Story they'll do a remaster.
That's
Which
going to be the most cursed fucking thing. Could you imagine a live action Toy Story?
a live action Toy Story with Tom Hanks and Tim Allen playing
Oh
Buzz
my god.
Lightyear.
Oh my god. I mean, Chris Evans is going to be Buzz Lightyear in the new Lightyear movie. Maybe they'll recast Buzz Lightyear to be Chris Evans instead of Tim Allen.
Wait, really? I mean,
Mhm.
I've seen the Lightyear trailer, but I didn't realize they were. I've heard several. So this is a very tangent thing, but I've heard several people describe Lightyear as a prequel to Toy Story. It's just like a what's it called, like
It it is taking this Buzz Lightyear mythos seriously, as far as I understand.
right,
Right?
but it is like it is almost as if it were a movie within the Toy Story universe, right? Like you could.
Yeah.
It is not supposed to be like a thing like a true prequel to Toy Story. That would be very weird. Um,
Yep.
but yeah, no, it's I actually so like seeing the trailer, I just think that that's like kind of amazing, right? That like this thing that is a piece of like fiction inside of a movie is becoming like its own piece of fiction for the second time, right? Like there was like a Lightyear cartoon.
Yeah,
Uh,
there was the Buzz Lightyear cartoon that I have watched a lot of, and I'm wondering how much of lore from that cartoon is going to stick around.
oh
My
God.
guess is very little, but who knows?
Oh man, I want to see like I want to see like a deep lore discussion of like the timelines in the Lightyear universe.
A
Light
serious lore analysis, yeah.
of the Lightyear cinematic universe.
I mean, I don't even, is Commander Zurg gonna be in it, right? Like
Yeah,
Commander
I
Zurg
think
is
he was in
like,
the trailers.
oh, okay.
Yeah. Because I mean, theoretically, like Pixar has like cross references in all of its movies, right? Like theoretically, there could be a Pixar cinematic universe, which would be
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Lightyear trailer, I remember when I first watched it was weird how not cartoony it was, right? In the sense that like it looks like a real
like they're playing it straight.
place. Yeah, like yeah. And there's just so much to the animation that's very like grounded and lived in and not, like cartoons polish off that stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is just weird and interesting.
Yeah, especially because like it definitely has that feel, although it definitely also has like Buzz Lightyear looks like Buzz Lightyear, and not in kind of
Yeah.
this is in a reimagining. It looks like Buzz Lightyear, including like the weird chin swirly thing, right? Like,
Hmm. Yeah, his little like butt chin.
yeah. I don't know. But yeah, to bring it back to video game reviews, I guess. I don't know. I feel like we haven't actually said a lot about like how to actually do this because
Honestly, we basically have just discussed the problem and then avoided saying anything more specifically about it. It feels like.
yeah. So like this is an interesting question, right? Like I famously, if I can't put in the configuration that I want to be able to control the game, I won't play the game, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's a hard stop for me. But that's also not like necessarily a common thing that goes into to the review of a game. Do you have any kind of like hard limits in any of these aspects there, right? Like,
Man, I don't know. There's an interesting. Huh. So to describe a problem that has happened to me in Elden Ring, I wonder if this counts. Okay, so I basically have quit Elden Ring at this point. Because I got so frustrated with one boss fight. Do you know about Volcano Manor?
are you talking about the? I teleported there from underneath.
Because you got sucked into the guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you died in there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so that is also true of me. I was in the academy, I got sucked into one of those guys and I died. And if you die when you get sucked into one of those guys, you go to the bottom of Volcano
It's a specific
Manor.
one. Like there's like I actually knew that was going to happen because an NPC tipped me off to it, or like a note tipped me off to it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But that's that one specifically that does that.
Oh, I did
Yeah.
not know that. But whatever the case may be, I then went through and I did the thing. I kept falling down like these shafts until I found a point of grace, and then I fell down another shaft, and there's two of those guys, and this is a boss fight, right? And to me, this boss fight is bullshit. Because the only thing it tests is my ability to control the camera, basically, right? As long as I can see the two guys, I'm fine, basically, right? But the way the camera works in Elden Ring is so finicky and so hard to maneuver, and this room is so hard to maneuver, that it just felt to me like the entire difficulty of this was just, can you control the camera well enough to just see the guys appropriately, right? And I decided that was bullshit, and I don't care, and that's dumb, and I'm just not dealing with it. And so I just stopped. I couldn't figure out. At first, I tried to leave, and I couldn't figure out a way to get out of this position. And I was like, I guess I have to beat this boss to go forward. I couldn't teleport out. I couldn't figure, like, maybe there's a hallway to leave. And I was just like, I was so frustrated with that whole interaction that I was just like, you know what? Fuck it. I don't need to worry about this. And I basically like put the game down entirely. And I do think that that is a process I've gone through before, where I've hit a point in a game where it feels like there's no way forward, and I'm just uninterested in figuring out how to progress, right? Like theoretically I could do another thing with Tree Sentinel where I go and I do this boss fight for 4.5 hours over multiple days of attempts, and I eventually get through there. But the thing about Tree Sentinel was it felt like it was testing skills that I felt like were fair to test, right? Can I dodge appropriately? Can I exploit good interactions, against Tree Sentinel to open him up to powerful attacks, etc. Because this boss fight seems to just revolve around maneuvering the finicky camera of Elden Ring, I just felt like that was not that's not a fun boss fight to do essentially progression on, right? And so that suggests that yes, the answer to that is yes, but maybe it's context based, because what are the fair things to test and what are the unfair things to test is a conversation and a discussion that is like not as cut and dry as the keybinds aren't like opening the game up for me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's fair. I also hated that boss fight. I managed to beat it after a number of tries, and I didn't have as many problems with the camera as much as I did with kind of like legibility of attacks. Like the grab attack like behaves weirdly when they're next to each other.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then like they will clip through each other, so
Yeah.
I can be looking at one of them, but then the scythe will come through the model of the other. It's like, I don't know. I just hated all of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And did you? I assume you found the site of grace, right? You weren't just running from the beginning. Whole time.
No, yeah. There's a site of grace, right?
Okay.
That's where I am locked. Essentially, I could not figure out. I my first instinct was just to leave. I was like, I don't want to do this boss fight. Okay. And then I just looked all around the room. There didn't seem to be any other openings or like nooks or crannies that I missed. And because I'm in this dungeon, I can't teleport out. So I was just like, I'm like, where do I fucking go?
Yeah. I wonder if there's a way to get around that, because like I was consider like I basically did it in like this happens occasionally, which I don't like, but like I don't like some of these, like I find the multi-member boss fights to be a lot harder, just because like partly it's the way I'm playing, but also like it's just like more bodies is much harder to deal with in Elden Ring than like bigger enemies. But like the way it usually works out for me with some of these multi fights is I have to get a run where my summon happens to hold the attention of one of the members for long enough for me to deal with the other one.
Oh yeah, it's true. Maybe this is where I will finally break my no summons theory and actually engage with it. Like I haven't wanted to do summons because I just kind of like the idea of fighting a boss fight, sort of like one-on-one. Like I don't, I think there are people who think of like summons as like cheese or whatever, and yeah, I think that's unfair. But yeah,
Yeah,
that is definitely maybe a way to kind of get past it, because otherwise I've been having a pretty okay time with Elden Ring, right? Like it's not my favorite thing, but I do have the itch to sort of like get on and do it. And it was insane to me how much that boss just destroyed my desire to play.
no, hey,
Right?
no,
Like,
and this is the thing. Like there is generally at least once per game a boss that sucks in these Dark Souls games, and Elden Ring is unique in that in most of those games you can't just go somewhere else, right? Like you have to, like
yeah.
they're relatively linear. Um, Although that's like when I was first learning these games, I spent like hours in Bloodborne on Father Gascoigne, just because I couldn't beat it, and that was tough. But that was also like that was kind of like the good difficulty, right? There's like the tree sentinel difficulty, and he's like Father Gascoigne isn't bullshit, but like there are like enemies that suck, right? And so like how much of that is a deal breaker? Like this is kind of like your thoughts about Mass Effect 3, right? Like if the ending's bad, does that ruin the rest of the game, which is good? And
Yeah, I mean, I explained this, I made a big Reddit comment the other day. So obviously the Sylvanas novel is out. We've ended patch 9.2 story progression or whatever. We're sort of in the rear view of most of Shadowlands story, right? Everybody basically expects that 9.2.5 will have a little bit of story content, but mostly we are kind of like looking forward from here. And I described the Tyrande Whisperwind Night Fae, storyline, right, with the Night Warrior as the best writing that WoW has ever done, right? which is a crazy thing to say because everybody fucking hates Shadowlands, right? That the idea that the best writing in Warcraft history is in Shadowlands is kind of nuts. And so somebody responded to me and they were like, what is your argument for that? And I basically lined out how the Tyrande storyline is really thematically complex because she is she is the Sylvanas to Sylvanas's Arthas, right? In the same way that the story in Shadowlands relates Sylvanas to Arthas. She is a woman who has become so corrupted by her obsession with vengeance that she has become the thing that she sought vengeance against, right? Tyrande is in the position that Sylvanas was in, right? And she is now succumbing to her own corruption to vengeance or obsession with vengeance against Sylvanas herself, and that's literalized through like the Night Fae or through the Night Warrior power. And I just kind of laid out how that's really probably the most thematically and richest story that Warcraft has ever even attempted, right? Mostly Warcraft stories are much more linear and much more straightforward than that, right? In Mists of Pandaria, Vol'jin and Garrosh hate each other in the beginning and hate each other. Like nobody really has a character arc through that. It's just that it is difficult to take down the raid boss in story terms that is Garrosh Hellscream, right? There isn't any kind of like change or growth necessary for that compared to Tyrande, who does legitimately have to sort of like change and grow, right? Tyrande wants vengeance, but in order to get the justice that she needs to resolve, right, like the anger that she feels towards Sylvanas, she actually needs to give up her obsession with vengeance in order to get that, as we would later see, because she's the one who condemns Sylvanas to the maw at the end of at the end of Shadowlands story or whatever, right? And so I laid all of that out, and somebody came back and kind of pointed at problems, right, in the thing that I was kind of like laying out. And I just kind of said, and this is something I've said on the podcast before, right, which is that something can be the best without being perfect, right? Because in the same way that like a high schooler who passes the AP English test with a 4 out of 5, right, is doing harder, better, higher quality work than a second grader who gets a perfect score on a book report. Right? They are both being essentially tested on the exact same sort of set of skills in terms of, reading comprehension and, an ability to sort of craft arguments about a piece of literature. But because the AP test is so much more demanding of the high school senior than the second grader than the book report is demanding of the second grader, it is therefore higher quality stuff, right? Even if it is sort of imperfect. And that I think is an underpinning philosophy that I have that not a lot of people would necessarily agree with, right? We would, even though Arthas, for instance, has a simpler arc than Tyrande, and is that his story in Warcraft 3 is a much simpler, more straightforward story, right? Because it doesn't have as many, like holes or things you'd fix or change or, improve, something you would change to make it better, right? That makes it a better story. And I think that that's kind of like a real sort of kind of question for individual people when it comes to these sorts of reviews, right? Is it more important that the thing be kind of holistically perfect and above reproach? Or is it more important for it to be, trying its hardest, right? Doing the most that it can, offering you the most with its premise, right? And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean this is this thing you talk about a lot, right? Like, what does it shoot for the moon or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's like that's it's an interesting point with this kind of stuff too, right? Like, every um f- I'm going to use the zero punctuation term for it, which just because I don't have a better word for this style of game. He calls it like Jiminy Cockthroat, which is kind of like this open world crafting systems. Every Ubi game plus Horizon plus like um, in the kind of that vein, of which like Elden Ring and like say Breath of the Wild are kind of adjacent to, but not quite. Like every one of those games, like probably has a lot more technical merit to it than Elden Ring does, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they look prettier, um, and they're probably a lot smoother executing, right? Like the Assassin's Creed games that we've played have been pretty well executed, right? Like, um, it's been interesting to follow like Call of Duty games, which are not that, but like they're their own style of kind of like very formulaic game. Because like every one of those games kind of like does mostly the same thing, and then like every couple of years the press collectively will kind of decide that this one was the one that was like too similar to the last one, and so it's bad, which doesn't like make a ton of
Yeah,
sense.
and there's a real thing about like what are the improvements that matter. So like to go back to Total Warhammer 3 for a second. It was interesting because there was a time when the Total War subreddit was really up in arms about this anger, right, that I was sort of talking about, where every post was about how much the Chaos Realms sucked, how much the Rifts sucked, like and all this other sort of stuff, right? And then one day, the top post was like, I hate Total War Warhammer 3, but I can't go back to Total War Warhammer 2. And the guy basically describes, you know, he's having the same sorts of issues and frustrations with Total War Warhammer 3 that everyone else is, right? And so he was like, well, I hate this shit. Let me go back to the game that I loved, Total War Warhammer 2. But he goes back to Total War Warhammer 2, which has the old versions of the siege battles, right? Which are all the same. You just kind of attack the wall. You have these like open land battles or whatever, and you have much more lockdown rosters. Total War Warhammer 3 has much better diplomacy options, for instance, and there's a lot of interactions with alliances, right? And he was basically like, and I can't do it anymore, right? I want to go back and I want to play Escapement Campaign, but because the improvements that came in Warhammer 3 were so good, even if it also introduces a bunch of mechanics that are really pissing me off, I'm now in this position where I just kind of can't play a Total War game. And I think that is a really interesting sort of especially in these very, very long running series, like Total War, Destiny, WoW, like any of the live service games, right?
And any of the Paradox games, right? Like whenever EU5 comes out, it's not going to have all the DLC of EU4, right?
Yeah.
Like, and like I can't go back to CK2, right?
Mhm.
Like even though it's to be fair to Paradox, I think they do a better job than most companies in like putting enough of the things that happened in the previous game and not selling them as DLC in the next game. But there's still some of that, right? Like CK2 is a little bit, I'd say, much more feature complete than CK3, but I'm not going to go back to that. There's too much quality of life improvement.
Yeah, this has literally happened to me with Europa Universalis, which I used to say was the best strategy game I had ever played because it just had these insanely complicated systems, right? And I spent literal hours of my life that I will never get back, right? Learning the ins and outs, because the thing that really appealed to me to that game was colonization and trade, right? It was so fun to go colonize the new world, right? And dominate these trade nodes and exert all this trade power and protect your trade power as it goes across the sea. And I was like, oh well, there's the trade power that collects in what is the Gibraltar, there's the trade node that collects in Rotterdam, there's a trading, like whatever. And I learned all of those mechanics. And then I went back to the game and they had rewritten the rules on trade. And I was just like, I can't do this. I can't do this again. You can't get me again. And so like, yeah, that is a real problem and no movie will ever have to face that, right? No TV show will ever really have to face that because like when does a TV show patch, right? You know what I mean? Like,
I mean,
I don't know.
I think it can in like a different way, right? Like, how good was Game of Thrones until the last seasons?
Oh, that is actually really interesting. Especially because the end of Game of Thrones retroactively ruins the rest of the series, right? I'm that guy. I've never gone back to. I used to watch Game of Thrones every year, like start to back, right? I would do a full rewatch of the whole series in preparation for the next season's release. And I loved that experience. I loved that experience going into season 8 because I was a defender of it, right? And the ending was just so awful that it completely wiped it out for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is less permanent, but I don't think I've watched Star Wars since Rise of Skywalker came out.
I also haven't watched Star Wars since Rise of Skywalker, which is actually kind of nuts, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, I mean, especially given that like the sequel series are very easily divorceable from like the 6 previous films, right? Like
Yeah.
each trilogy is relatively divorceable. especially in chronological order.
Yeah, like there is our mythical Mandalorian season 2 episode, which we're almost at the Mandalorian season 3 at this point. It feels
Yeah,
like, right? We're
yeah.
coming up on, I guess the Boba Fett, not Boba Fett. The Boba Fett actually came out.
Book
Jesus
of
Christ!
Boba
I
Fett,
guess the
yeah.
Obi-Wan is coming out next, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Wow, holy shit. What a world.
yeah.
Right? But yeah, that absolutely is true. And it's funny because the opposite is also true, right? A YouTuber named Taliesin, the Taliesin Evitel, he's like a WoW YouTuber. He talked about how he retroactively likes the story of Shadowlands more because it stuck the landing, right? Because it ended in a way that was satisfying and complete, and it actually kind of put a bow on things in a way that people found to be satisfying. And and part of that is a unique thing to WoW, which is that people are constantly predicting the future in that game, and they are also very cynical and predicting the worst future possible, right? So when the game does it well, that's a surprise and that feels good. But it's definitely got that effect of like, oh my God, actually, I was kind of not really sold on this series of events, but now I sort of am, and I am retroactively kind of brought back into the series as a whole because it had a really good whatever season, right?
Yeah, I mean, just it's the matter of like holding on to that point, right? Like, um, but yeah,
Honestly, that also happened to me with Game of Thrones, right? Because season 5 of Game of Thrones was famously very wonky, and oh man, season 5 had Hard Home, right?
I don't know. I watched all at once, as you
Yeah,
might
okay.
remember.
Yeah. So season 5 was very rough, and people really hated season 5 of Game of Thrones. But then Hard Home came out, which is the episode where, like Jon Snow goes and he rescues a bunch of like wildlings, and like they're fighting the White Walkers or whatever. And that episode is so fucking good that it like retroactively got people back on board with with the rest of the season. I think I even said as much in our big Game of Thrones review, right? Like I talked about how it's really hard for me to hate season 5 because Hard Home is like, if not the single best episode of Game of Thrones, one of the, like all-time bangers.
Yeah, no, I don't know. It's weird, right? Because like, I'm thinking about this, and like, I pretty famously dislike anything that tries to do a sequel stuff to Watchmen, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I was not a huge fan of the TV series. I'm not like, just because of like my thoughts about like how Watchmen ends. But that doesn't keep me from like going back and occasionally reading Watchmen or rewatching the Zack Snyder movie, right? Like, I don't have those same feelings, but I definitely have those feelings in other places. I guess maybe it's like the directness of the
Man,
connection.
yeah, that is true. I was really going apeshit for Watchmen too because of the one episode that I thought was absolutely like insanely good, right? When she finds out that Hooded Justice, you find out that Hooded Justice was like this gay black guy who, and the reason he has that noose is because he was almost lynched as a police officer or whatever. Like that episode of Watchmen was transcendently amazing, right? And it all just kind of got pissed away because the ending sucked. I
Yeah.
haven't thought about Watchmen basically ever since, right?
Yeah, no, but that doesn't keep me from disliking, or from that doesn't keep me from liking like the original Watchmen. Maybe that's like, I don't know why that works for me for Watchmen, but not for Star Wars, right? Like, and I feel like Star Wars may eventually fade. Like, I don't know, I don't know.
I sort of think that Star Wars and I are on a break, but we're gonna end up
Yeah,
getting back
yeah,
together.
that's probably
Like
true.
I'm gonna drunkenly text Star Wars one night, and we're gonna get together, and I'm gonna have a pretty good time, and I'm gonna be like, all right, it's all right, whatever.
Yeah,
That was a rough patch. Let's just not talk about it.
I still have my Star Wars wallet. I still have my R2D2 stuff
I
scattered around
do
my
want to
house.
do a rewatch. We famously did rewatches of the Rise Last Jedi. Like it
Yeah,
was like a year later we did an episode that's like The Last Jedi 1 year later. And I do sort of want to do that for Rise of Skywalker, though it would be Rise of Skywalker like 4 years later at this point. Um but also I also just don't want to watch the movie again. So
yeah, yeah, yeah. Boy, boy. All right. Well, we're an hour past start
yeah,
point.
that was a very meandering episode,
Yeah.
but whatever. I hope that was interesting, everybody. What was your week like, Mango?
It was pretty all right. So I didn't end up playing a ton of games just because my family visited me. I watched some hockey, which was interesting. I watched Frozen. I watched two of the three games of the Frozen Four, um, which is the big NCAA uh, uh, final tournament. It's kind of like in parallel to March Madness, but it's hockey, so less people care. Um, the thing that was most notable to me about that game, like not to do with like the game itself, just because like it's hockey. If you like hockey, it was decent hockey. Um, uh, I mean, so actually, before I talk about that, I do think that there's something interesting to be said about like college sports are different. Like, obviously, they're different from professional sports, but they're interesting because you are in some part watching them because you know they are not as good as professionals, and so you get to see like a little bit more rough edge, and that's like interesting in a lot of ways. I know that college basketball is particularly popular, especially when compared to its professional counterpart, just because like the flaws kind of make it more interesting.
Yeah, this is famously also true. I used to go watch the Newark Bears all the time. You know, the Newark
Oh
Bears were just a
man,
couple train stops down. It was $7 to get a ticket. The stadium, you're right there, right? And the games are really interesting and fun because, you know, somebody once told me that the flaw in baseball is that a baseball game played perfectly has no action, right?
yeah.
Because the perfect game is a pitcher just gets strikes it out every time. No, nobody matters except for the pitcher and the batter, right? And I guess technically like the catcher, right? Um,
It's
and
I'm just thinking of the discussion we had about Harry Potter last week. Um, about like nobody
oh, about
matters.
Quidditch, yeah. Well, baseball is kind of like that, right? Yeah, like baseball has it has this sort of end state. It actually reminds me a little bit of StarCraft 2, right? We've talked about how StarCraft 2 kind of the more RTSs got refined, the more narrow they become because the only thing that mattered was APM, right?
Right.
At the end of the day, StarCraft 2 just became a game that measured APM and the person who had more APM won. And that's not an interesting or compelling way to design, a game. And I think baseball has a similar sort of thing. The more we have perfected the baseball, the more boring it is, right? But going to a AAA baseball game where people are, there's a lot of walks, there's a lot of base hits, there's a lot of stealing bases that doesn't work out. It's just like it is a game which is less serious, and therefore there's just like more fuck ups, and the fuck ups are what make it fun. So I absolutely feel that about college sports, college basketball, etc.
You know the New York Bears Stadium isn't there anymore, right?
No, what happened?
I mean, apparently it was like always like a financial failure. Like I remember when they built it, but because I drove past it recently, or drove past. So that is the exit that like brings you into the Ironbound. Like my family
Mhm.
would go to dinner to my family particularly likes Fornos of Spain, which is a restaurant in
Yeah, my family famously likes Iberian Peninsula. My dad now lives in the Ironbound district,
yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I've been to my family didn't particularly like. Is it Iberian? I thought it was Iberia, but whatever
It
it
might just
was.
be called
Yeah,
Iberia or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah. I mean, there's a couple different there's like a couple churrascarias in there too that are very good.
Mhm.
You know, pro tips from for dining from the alternate food universe of this
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah, yeah. Of the food, yeah, the food podcast. Our favorite restaurants in the Ironbound district of Newark.
Yeah. But like apparently like it was supposed to be like this big project to like revitalize part of that area, and it just it never took off. Right. Like it was always a financial failure. Um. But yeah.
Well, rest in pepperonis to the
Yeah.
to the to the Newark Bears.
Bears.
But
Yeah.
yeah, so college sports, I definitely feel that about college sports. Though I mean, I'm not a sports guy in general, so it'll never sort of really matter for me.
Yeah.
But
No, we've talked about maybe doing a sports episode at some point from like a
yeah, I
games.
mean, funnily enough, hockey is a sport that I quite like, and I specifically quite like watching it because I think hockey is this. The thing about hockey that really appeals to me is it is this cross, like this crossroads of grace and like brutality that's neat. Like
Yeah.
these guys are there's all this, it's flow and it's speed or whatever, but then every once in a while somebody just gets like shoulder checked into the boards, and it's like, oh fuck, like,
Uh, although the game has become less about the force and more about the grace,
that's true.
in the recent years. But That's fine. Anyway, the point I was winding back to is besides the hockey, which was fun, was so this is in the TD Garden, which is like the Bruins' home stadium. I think it's also the Celtics' home stadium or the Celtics' home stadium. Uh, and as things are going on, like in between, like when there's like a commercial break or whatever, they'll play like songs over the thing or over like
Hmm.
through the stadium, right? And I promise you, it was like a fucking cartoon. They put on Ship It Up to Boston, and like the fucking stadium just erupts, right? As if like it was like this is not real. It was like any meme you could make about it was true. It was like but it was fun. It was a lot of fun. I recommend like I mean the food prices were bad, but that's any stadium. I recommend games at the TD Garden, I guess. The other thing
I've never really done LA sports, right? Like I've never done Dodger Stadium, never been to it is no longer the Lakers, or it's no longer the Staples Center. It is now, I think it's the crypto.com
oh, is it really?
center now. It got
But it's
renamed.
but it's the same building, right?
Yeah. Is now the crypto.com arena. Hate that. Like
Hate it more than Staples.
yeah, it's true. I mean, I don't really give the Staples Center just sort of rolled off the tongue in a way that was fine, but okay, sure. The crypto.com arena, here we are. The year of our Lord. I've never been to they call it the Freeway series, right? There's the Subway series, which is the Mets versus the Yankees. The Freeway series is the Anaheim Angels versus the LA Dodgers. Never been to an LA Kings game, which I don't even know where they play. I know they actually practice very near us, because the LA Lakers and the LA Kings have this like kind of compound that's like a mile from my house. But
Yeah,
yeah,
don't you
I've
live near
just never.
or maybe you moved since then, but didn't you live near the newish Rams stadium, the LA Rams?
Oh yeah, the Rams Stadium is also like a mile from our house. So I have also never done the Rams, right? And they just won the fucking Super Bowl, I guess.
So something to know if you ever decide you want to, something that this is a thing that I can say that I hated about this. Um, you're a big person, I'm a bigger person. The kind of cheap seats I don't fit in. Like straight up I fit in them, but I am so like broad shouldered that it was me, my dad, and my brother, and none of us are small people. And just kind of like in the seats, which was not fun.
Sure.
But that's that's I guess how it goes. But I think it's a cool thing to do. I am I'm not a big fan of watching baseball, but I do like occasionally going to a live game just because I think it's neat. I actually kind of like baseball more because you can like bullshit during the game, and it's not like you're missing it, right? Like there's
Hmm.
it's relatively slow. And so I don't particularly like watching it on television, but I do like going to games. Like I went to a Braves game a handful of years ago in Atlanta, which was a lot of fun. Um, also, because there's so many baseball games, you can occasionally get decent seats for like not a ton of money, unlike
Hmm.
say football, where it's like there's like 13 games, and so
Yeah, I mean, it's literally an order. It's like an order of magnitude more baseball games, right? The baseball season is hundreds of games.
yeah, oh
Pretty
yeah,
sure
yeah,
it's like 100 and something.
yeah, and hockey's also a lot of games, but football's the only one where you do like one game and when it's done. But uh, but yeah, other
162 games is a season of baseball, which is
wow, a lot of
a
baseball.
lot. Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, other than that, I did see the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. It was not initially playing in my local theater, but then I found out that it's playing a very limited run like this week. So I went yesterday when I had like a spare moment, um, and I thought that was very good. Um, it's it's interesting because I think it kind of fits into this kind of like reaches for the shoots for the moon and kind of like messes a little bit on the implementation, but I still thought it was amazing. Um,
Hmm.
uh, there's a kind of like it's interesting because there's like a handful of films kind of in this kind of like very specific theming of like Asian family dynamics. That obviously I can't directly relate to because I'm not an Asian person. Very also similar to I guess Turning Red, which has its other metaphors, but I think there's enough there that like a neutral audience can also hold on to it. It's very kind of like I think the theming's a little bit confused, but I think it's ultimately good. It's kind of like very probably a rejection of nihilism at its core, which I think is which I think is handled really well, and isn't just kind of like like I think there is a good exploration of the whole theme without it just kind of being like, and nihilism is bad, which you can kind of like fall into. Like it's like a kind of way to fall into. But I would highly recommend it to anybody. It's an A24 film. Um, I think they do some very interesting stuff with the cinematography. Although I'm no expert in that arena.
Can't believe I wasted one of my like free movie tickets this month on fucking Morbius. The movie that I really want to see is Ambulance Ants, which is the new Michael Bay movie that everyone on Twitter says is really good, which is like I have been living for this moment, right? Like I have never wanted something more in my fucking life than for Michael Bay to make a a mid-budget action movie that is unfiltered, like unbound by franchise or VFX and it to be good, right? Like this is the perfect Michael Bay sort of movie. Plus it features Jake Gyllenhaal and Yahya Abdul God, what is his name? It's the guy who played it's the guy who played Black Manta in Aquaman. But I just think that I just want that movie because I think, obviously I think Michael Bay is a good talented director when he does movies that are made for him.
Yeah,
And this sounds perfect for that.
I'm very much looking forward to Sonic, which unfortunately I couldn't see last week, which is why we're doing this episode instead of the Sonic 2 episode.
Yeah, that's true.
I've heard good things about that. I hear it's more of the first one, which honestly has me excited.
I am also sort of excited, especially because this looks like maybe outside of Warcraft, I would say the most authentically like video game aesthetic movie, right? Of just like balls to the wall, absolutely unhinged high fantasy, right? Like
Yeah.
on screen compared to the first one, which was like relatively contained, all things considered.
Yeah. Well, just to finish my thoughts out on everything everywhere all at once, I realized I didn't kind of like give you a base plot thing. So like, essentially, it's very science fiction. It's this woman who runs a laundromat with her husband, gets contacted by an alternate universe version of her husband, and needs to do some like her brain needs to do some universe hopping to like save the world or something like that. And it's very, like I said, it's very, very good. It's got some interesting. It's one of those things where, like, again, like Shooting for the Moon is like, if you think about it too hard, some of the things don't make sense. But just don't think about it too hard, and I think you'll be fine. And I think it's definitely worth a watch. So I'm gonna say Everything Everywhere All at Once gets 2 thumbs up from Mango. Buddy, how was your week?
Oh man, honestly, what did I even do this week? I wanted to play Total War Warhammer 3, but I kind of like never got around to it. I have like been weirdly going apeshit for legendaries in WoW because they're selling like hotcakes, and I'm just like really deep in that economy. And I feel bad because like, one of the things about WoW's game design is that it is servicing a zillion different types of players, right? Like M+ players are different than PvPers, they're different than raiders, whatever else. And legendaries are a pain point for a lot of players in Warcraft, right? Because they are really expensive to buy them off the auction house. But as a crafter, I don't think I have ever been happier, right, playing the game. And I don't think I've ever really like felt like the master blacksmith that I am because I can make these incredibly, powerful items. Than right now, and it kind of comes at the like my enjoyment as a player kind of comes at the expense of the frustration of all of the people I'm selling legendaries to for huge profit margins, but also just like that's kind of the point, and I'm not gonna apologize for having fun. But yeah, besides that, I did play a bunch of Elden Ring, and did I tell you where was the last point I got off before we continued talking about Elden Ring?
I think you were heading into the academy because you wanted to get your katana.
Okay, I got my special sword that I was looking for, my new katana, and I was heading into the academy. Yeah, so I headed into the academy. The academy's easy as fuck. I couldn't believe I was like, I just have done this wrong, I guess, I think. I went into the academy, and at the top of the academy is a wolf boss that took me 2 tries, right? Like once I figured out to dodge, he has these these like blue knives that strike out at you or whatever. Once I figured out how to dodge those, I was solid for forever. I had no further issues uh with that boss, which literally was like the second try. Though I did have a couple of issues with a couple of rooms where like those mages are casting too kind of too quickly in in succession. And then I eventually got to a place where I didn't know where to go in the academy, right? So I started go and I remembered there was that lift, right? And I was like, "Oh, well maybe I can go to that lift and go down." Right. And there'll be something at the bottom. And sure enough, yes, there was something at the bottom. It was that crystal, it was that abductor guy, and he sucked me into Volcano Manor, which sucked. Which continues to suck. And maybe I don't know, maybe I'll figure some way out of it. I'm at a weird spot. I think it's because I got the sword. The thing, I was very animated to play Elden Ring because I wanted to get the better, longer katana, right? And now that I have that katana, I'm sort of out of it, right? Like I don't have a real goal anymore. Um and so maybe that's part of why like the frustration of ending up in Volcano Manor like got to me in this particular way.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you just kind of also went the wrong way. Like going down is like a neat thing to do because of that particular encounter. But like,
Did I beat the academy? Is the wolf just the end of the academy?
no, no, no. So there's like a courtyard after the wolf, right?
Yeah.
You
And
kill it.
and I- and I- and I killed everything in that courtyard, and I went up onto the roofs, and then I did all this stuff on the roofs, and then I ended back in this cathedral, and I couldn't figure out what else to do. I couldn't
There's a
figure out where else to
staircase
go.
off to the right that you have to jump onto. Like in that courtyard, there's a big staircase off to the right that you can like walk over to on like a spindly part.
Oh, you're right.
That's where you go. And
Huh.
up there
I didn't
is
think
like,
about that.
yeah, up there is
Is
the
more
way.
stuff?
Oh
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, and will we ever get back there? Who knows,
yeah.
right? Like it's honestly interesting because I am now doing a little bit more weapon switching, right? I'm switching between Godric's axe and the katana. And the funny thing is I am now pumping my arcane because when you get that katana, you also get this, I don't know, blade thing. But and I think it keys off of bleeds, which I think is neat. Um uh my new katana is very good at bleeds, by the way, which is also why I think it's a lot of fun to use it. Um, but now I'm just pumping my arcane because once I get to 19 arcane, I can wield this whatever the thing was. Like the person that I had to kill in order to get the long katana also gave me this other cool bleed weapon, and now I want to try that out. And it puts me in this weird position of like, when we were doing Grime, there was a huge uh people really wanted the ability to test weapons and respec their character, right? And I now understand what they were feeling, right? Like at the time in Grime, that did not bother me at all. I thought that was I was it just wasn't something I was concerned with, right? Like we would eventually implement like respecking stuff, which I think was the right choice, but I just was not the kind of player that bothered me. But the more constrained um requirements to wield these weapons by using intelligence, arcane, faith, or whatever, rather than just in Grime, it's really just strength or dex, right? Do you want to go strength? Do you want to go dex? Has sort of changed my approach quite a lot.
Yeah, and hey, and if you want to respec, going up the staircases where you unlock the ability to respec in Elden Ring.
I didn't even know you could respec.
Yeah,
That's not true. I did know because I saw a Twitter thread about it where somebody said that it was too easy to respec in Elden Ring. They wished it was harder and there was more friction involved.
I mean you have to. There's only like so many of like the like you have to have an item. It's like the larval tear. You might have run into one of them. It looks like a placenta. Um, and once you beat the enemy at the top of the stairs, you'll figure it out. But that's uh that's where you respec if you want to. Um, yeah.
Okay, well, fair
Yeah,
enough.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did
Oh,
you
I
have
was
more?
just gonna say, like, I think it's like hard enough. Like, it's one of those things where like I think there's like maybe 13 or 14 of those items, which is like enough to like fool around if you want to fool around, but not so many that you just can kind of like do it on a whim, right?
Okay.
So yeah. Oh,
Yeah, I mean that was the thing in that was how we did respecs in Grime, right? Like you had to have a special item in order to do in order to do your respect. The other thing that I want to talk about in my week is Gay Pirates. Do you know the show Gay Pirates? It's not called that.
Oh,
It's called Our Flag Means Death.
Is this like the New Zealand like Taika Waititi? Yeah, I've heard of it. I haven't seen it yet.
It is very good, and I like it a lot. I watched the first 2 episodes with Rachel at the beginning of last like week or whatever, and it was just the first 2 episodes were like fine, they were funny, and I was kind of on board, but I felt very let down because everyone advertises this show as Gay Pirates, and I really wanted there to be gay pirates. And let me fucking tell you, this show gets so gay in like episode like 4 or 5 that it blew my mind, and I love every second of it. Like, like it is it's weird because like I'm obviously not do you know about slash fiction? Do you know like
I'm aware of what slash fic is. It's
yeah, to explain what slash fic is to people, it is fan fiction that is typically written by women that is placing 2 men in a relationship with one another, right?
Slash fic doesn't have to be homosexual, but it typically is because it's like teen girl fantasy. But
yeah, like the genesis of slash fic is Spock and Kirk fan fiction, right?
Well,
which was
it's X/Y. That's what the slash fic is, right?
Yeah. Which is the denotation in fan fiction, right? For a ship, right? Which is like a relationship between 2 characters. Spock/Kirk is like slash fic or whatever. And I can absolutely see how this was made for the slash fic audience, because it is just like, it's ridiculous how much this show is built for people who like slash fic and want to write slash fic, right? The famous one from the early aughts is called Super Wholock, which was a combination of Supernatural, Doctor Who, and the BBC Sherlock series with Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, and those were dominated by slash fics. In Supernatural, it was Castiel and not Dean, but the other Sam. No, maybe it was Dean.
I've never
Dean
watched
Winchester
any of these
and
shows,
Castiel. Yeah, so that was the big one, and like the big one in Sherlock was John Locke, which was the slash fic of John Watson getting together with Sherlock at like the end of the show. So much was that slash fake like a part of people's brains that they created an entire conspiracy about. Not only was John Locke like the relationship that they liked, but it was also going to become canon by the end of the show, and they were like decoding hints to prove it and that kind of thing.
Ascended canon.
Yeah, that kind of thing. It was obviously not true at all, by the way. That did not fucking happen. And the end of Sherlock, by the way, is another ending that also sucked and removed, talking about Game of Thrones, right? Like it was another ending that I have not watched an episode of Sherlock since this 4th season because it sucked so bad and was so awful.
I was under the impression that it wasn't very good in the first place. Like I've basically seen like that Mind Palace meme where he's like shoving words around and it like doesn't make any like that. It doesn't feel very. That didn't feel very Sherlock Holmes to me, as kind of a fan of some of the stories. But
Yeah. So it's not. It really is not. But the first 2 seasons legitimately like set up a neat kind of mystery, right? And and watching those was a great experience. It's sort of one of those rickety roller coaster things, right? Like you don't realize it until the ride is over how kind of like scotch taped together the whole thing was. But anyway, in the last episode of the 2nd season, Sherlock jumps off of a building, right? And John Watson watches him die. He watches him commit suicide because Moriarty has tricked Sherlock into this position where the only thing that he can do to, I think, save someone's life is to kill himself. Is to jump off the building. At the end of that episode, it shows John at Sherlock's grave, and then it shows Sherlock in the distance watching John, right? And the showrunners perpetuated this as like a mystery, as like a thing that can be solved if you only pay attention to the right clues. You can figure it out, right? And then the first episode of the 3rd season is basically a giant trolling, mean-spirited shitpost about those theories. Because John realizes that Sherlock is alive, right? There's all of these theories in the show that are pitched by crackpots about how did Sherlock live? How did John not see it? What was like the missing piece or whatever? And then later in the episode, Sherlock sits down with John Watson, and Sherlock begins to explain how he faked his death, and John slams his hand on the table and goes, "I don't care. I don't care how you did it. I care why. Why didn't you tell me?" Right? Which basically just means that the answer is fuck you. You don't get to know the
I would
answer.
say,
They
like,
never explain this. It is the
that's
most mean-spirited fucking thing to like tease your fans that there is an explanation for this, and then have one of your characters lambast the audience essentially for wanting an answer to the mystery of how someone faked their death in the mystery television
I was
show.
gonna say, like, in the fucking, like, that's the whole point of these of like the genre,
It
right?
is legitimately nuts to me how hard they went, right? To obscure, right? To obscure the answer to the Sherlock mystery.
Well, I'm glad I didn't watch it then, I guess.
Yep,
And
yep.
wait, and you
It
watched
sucked.
for like a full 2 seasons after that happened?
Yeah, but at that point it was mostly morbid curiosity. I was fully on team this show sucks at the end of or at the end of the first episode of the third season, right? Like that was such a fuck you that I thought it was so awful. But I was just kind of along for the ride. Why not, right?
Fair enough, I guess. I'm not gonna argue with that.
By the way, the rest of the show is a buck wild and also very bad. I would recommend there's the big H Bomber guy video that blew up. I mentioned it earlier in the podcast, was Sherlock is bad and here's why. He does a very good job of explaining why Sherlock is in fact a bad show.
Oh, you know what? You know what that reminds me of, just because H Bomber Guy featured in one of the reviews, is when we were. This is a callback to like the main episode content, but like, Mandalore did a full review, soup to nuts, technical to gameplay to theming, to sound design on Total Warhammer 3 on release, because he got early access to the game. Like, it wasn't as long as his Total Warhammer 2 review, which is the one that H Bomber Guy featured in.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So, people at home that don't know, he did it was like a 2 hours long or something like that. Total Warhammer 2 review, and H Bomber Guy played the voice of the High Elves, and Seth Zinch played the voice of the Dark Elves, and that is the most brilliant thing in the world if you know who those two people are. And and the Total War Warhammer 3 review wasn't as long, just because like it also wasn't a production, but it had a lot of those that things in it. But like, it was like, and so like that's like the only thing I could think of that would like hit that kind of like all of this, everything all at once, right? To call back to the movie. But yeah,
Yeah.
it was I just wanted to mention that. But anyway, do you want to talk about anything else for your week, or should we wrap this up?
I don't think I want to talk about anything else, so we can wrap up. Yeah.
All right. Well, if you'd like to talk to us about any of the things that we talked about on this episode, you can reach us at derpsgames@gmail.com, or podcast at derpsgames.com. You can follow us at twitch.tv/derpsgames. These episodes go out live, and you can ask us questions there too. As you might have heard, we were interacting with Arahe in the chat. You follow us on YouTube, where I post recordings of this when I remember to, which is not always just bad on my part. But you can also find us in all the podcatchers that exist. I think you can support us on Patreon if you really feel like it. That's everything I have. Buddy, you have anything else you want to promote?
I have nothing else I'm looking to promote.
Well, in that case, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.